So welcome everybody again. My name is Amitai Freeman. I'm the founding director of the Z3 Project, and this is our global digital launch of Young Zionist Voices, our newest book of the Z3 Institute. I'll talk about the Institute in a second. I just want to give a big picture, kind of overview of what we do at the Z3 Project before I bring up Dr. David Hazony, who's the head of our institute and the editor of this wonderful book for the conversation with our panelists. So the Z3 Project started about 10 years ago at the Palo Alto JCC, and with the idea that we need to figure out how to build a public square, robust public square that creates space for conversations about Israel, Judaism, Jewish peoplehood, and Zionism as a way to strengthen the relationship between diaspora Jewry and Israel. And over the course of the past 10 years, this project evolved from a one-day conference to a multifaceted project, which is what we're up to today. We have three areas of our work. One is, of course, our annual conference that happens in Palo Alto. We just had our 10th one in November, and our next one is next year. Alongside that, we also have a leadership development track where we work with community professionals from across the country to learn how to bring Z3 back into their own community. And we're seeing great growth through there. We are having a Z3 conference in Austin at the end of February, another Z3 conference in Miami, all led by our partners in the field, in these local communities. So that's the second kind of branch of our work. And then on the other side, the newest addition is the Z3 Institute, which we were very fortunate to have David join our team about a year ago at this point. And the idea really there is to create and generate the ideas and the thought leadership that is necessary for our community and propel the conversation in the direction that we want to see it go. So that we're creating this ecosystem. We have our partners on the ground, these other JCCs, other youth movements and camps who understand and internalize the Z3 approach and are ready to be a conduit to that. And on the other side, now we have this institute, which identifies the up-and-coming thought leaders and incentivizes the authorship of books and these ideas so they can be pushed out. So what is this Z3 idea that we're so excited about that kind of stands at the base of all our work? It was developed by our CEO and our president, Zach Bodner, early on, basically recognizing that the Jewish people are in a unique moment in our history. For the first time, we have both a strong homeland in Israel. Yes, it has its issues, of course, the ongoing war, the hostages that we are slowly seeing coming back. Of course, there's a lot going on, but still, for the first time, we've had this incredible state at this level. And at the same time, we have a thriving diaspora, which of course also has its challenges in areas of growth. But we've never had such a moment where we had both of these kind of centers coexisting. And that we believe that this conversation that is necessary between these two centers can really elevate who we are as a people and propel us into the next stage. That's the Z3 moment we are in, as compared to Z2, which was from the founding of the state till about 10 years ago, and Z1, which is the earlier side of the Zionist movement when this idea became a reality. So that's, very briefly, what we stand for and what we believe and what we're trying to promote. And we are here to create a conversation. We have three operating principles that inform every program that we do. We engage as equal partners, Jews from Israel and from the diaspora. We include diversity of voices. We're not looking to promote one approach to the conversation. And we work towards unity, but not uniformity. And those three ideals really are what drive us in our work. So that's the Z3 Project. And I'm excited about this event because this new institute has really been already starting to pump out. It's been now a year in the making. We have 3 books that came out. The first one is David's 65 Priorities for the Jewish People. The next one is Young Zionist Voices. I have my copy here. If you can see it with this background, you can also see it on the digital background. And the next one is that came out just recently is a case for due loyalty. But today we're here to talk about Young Zionist Voices. So I'm really, really excited to have this conversation with David. I'll bring him up. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit. And the flow of the event is as follows. David and I will have a short conversation about the book, a little bit about the background of it, how it came to be. And then I will turn it over to David, and David will call up the panelists and have a conversation with them about the pieces that they wrote. And we'll take it from there. And in the end, we'll have time for questions if you want to add them in the chat. And throughout, we'll collect them and we'll ask them at the end of the conversation. So without further ado, I'm really honored. It's my pleasure really to introduce. I mean, he's seen here his face on the screen. Dr. David Hazony, he is the senior fellow, Standard Fellow, and the director of the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities. And David, it's great. I'm calling from New York. You're in Jerusalem. This is, a true global peoplehood moment with our audience from all over, of course. And I'm excited to get this kicked off, this conversation kicked off and started.
Thank you so much, Amitai. Thank you for organizing this and the whole project, and for bringing me on board. I want to thank everyone who's joining us from far and wide. I believe we have people who got up super early in the morning as far as Australia. A little bit, and so they're the real heroes of today's event. A little bit of my background. I've been sort of in the think tank world for decades. I was involved in the creation of the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, did my academic studies in modern Jewish philosophy, but I was also the editor of public affairs journals of different kinds, as well as books, and I wrote a book. And so I've been in that planet for a long time. I've been very deeply concerned about the Jewish people as a whole. It felt to me like we as a people were spending all of our energies either on subdivisions of our people, Israelis, Americans, Orthodox, Reform, all these different subcategories, or more universally fighting for political goals, fighting for causes that are universal in nature, and that we kept sort of missing the actual Jewish peoplehood part. So in 2023, I published a book called Jewish Priorities, which had 65 essays from all across our entire people, from ultra-Orthodox to ultra-secular, from left and right politically, Israelis, Americans, and other diasporas, influencers and scholars, and you name it. That book was set to publish on October 23rd of 2023, which ended up being 2 weeks after October 7th. But despite that, or maybe because of it, the nature of the book, there was really a tremendous interest in the book and in hosting events across America. I went to America right after October 7th, and it gave me a really interesting opportunity to see what American Jews were experiencing in the wake of October 7th, to see how it was similar, but also how in some ways it was very different from what we Israelis had experienced during the first 2 weeks of the war. There was a lot among American Jews. There was a big sense of loneliness, of fear, of going through a personal trauma that the rest of the world around them didn't necessarily experience or see, and of looking for community with other Jews, which is why Jewish Priorities was such a draw. But I noticed that there was also, at the same time, there were two kinds of mobilization I identified. One was philanthropic mobilization for Israel, and the other was kind of this sort of spontaneous grassroots mobilization taking place on campuses and in communities around America, where by and large it was being undertaken by young people. And we started talking about potentially what would the follow-up to Jewish Priorities be? What would the next book be? And so we thought, wouldn't it be really an important thing to do to bring together these really spirited, proud Jews, young Jews from across America and beyond, into a single volume? It would, part of the purpose is to kind of plant a flag in the sand and let everybody know that this is not just isolated individuals or small groups who are fighting back against the sudden waves of anti-Semitism that engulfed many of the campuses and many urban centers, but also to send a signal to the older generations that a new organic leadership is emerging for the Jewish community. And so we reached out, we did all the networking and identified total, what ended up being 31 contributors. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have. Some of them are undergraduates at elite campuses in America. Some are young professionals. We also have a bunch who live in Israel. Some of them are Israelis, as we call them. Others are Olim. We have representatives from the United Kingdom and from Australia as well. And it was really just a remarkable, for me, it was a very powerful experience, because when I started asking them to start writing their ideas, and each essay covers a different kind of thesis, a different idea for the collective Jewish future, I realized that there's a lot of thinking going on, very profound. A lot of the vocabulary is not the vocabulary I grew up with in when I was in young Judea, in New Jersey, and then in New England as a kid. It's a development. It's a new vocabulary, a new set of ideas that are, I have no doubt, are going to come to dominate the American Jewish conversation for years to come.
Thank you, David. So, I mean, I have a couple questions, about the book just to get us started. You kind of started to address it a little bit, but I want to ask you to dig a little bit deeper. You mentioned that the book was born, after, in the heels of the 65 priorities, right? And kind of your tour in the U.S. post 10/7 and kind of understanding it. But anthologies of this sense are not the typical kind of approach for books. So I'm curious if you can kind of elaborate a little bit more about, when did you realize that's the way to go, as opposed to, maybe an interview approach or something else to raise that the profile of these
Well,
thinkers.
I think that books in general can have a very powerful impact on our ideas. Start with that, bare bones. That if you think of a lot of the expressions we use, a lot of the terms that we use to discuss things that are important to us, very often we don't know, but that they actually are traced back to a best-selling book. So when we talk about The Tipping Point, or we talk about influencers, that's a Malcolm Gladwell book that we're quoting without even necessarily knowing it. When we talk about The Startup Nation, that's a best-selling book by Dan Senor and Saul Singer. And we wouldn't, even if we never read the book, never bought the book, we wouldn't be talking about Israel in this way had they not written the book. Anthologies have an additional kind of power to them, which is that they can essentially shape the consciousness of what is happening, what new movements are arising. They can create a kind of snapshot in time of an awful lot going on, of thinking and writing about a particular issue or among a certain community. And that's kind of what I was hoping to achieve with Young Zionist Voices, to give voice in the form of a book to many of these young activists who are, understandably very, very focused on the fight that they're fighting right now. And so I was very grateful to them for being willing to take the time out, because I think that it really does achieve that.
Excellent, excellent. So, for those of us who haven't read it yet, the book, you list a bunch of or several themes that kind of emerged as you were editing these pieces and also selecting them, because there are 31, but there were more that you had to go through. It wasn't just the first 31 that came in and we have a book.
Right.
It was a little bit more of a process behind it. So I'm curious if you want to share with us a little bit about the themes and what you saw emerge.
I think there are basically three crucial themes that I took away from my experience reading these and editing these. One is just the concept of fighting back. That these are writers who feel that it's not an obvious thing that if someone attacks you, you fight back. And this is a Jewish instinct that's been ingrained for centuries. That what do? Do we think about leaving? Do we think about keeping our heads down? Oh, maybe we should fight back. It's not intuitive. And so the argument needs to be made for why we should be fighting back at all. Which is also an argument that I tried to make in an essay in Sapir Journal a month after October 7th, called "The War Against the Jews," because I felt that among the older generations, they hadn't internalized that they were the ones who were under attack. They saw it as an Israel activism issue to go help Israel. The second theme is that there's a lot of exploration to what the word Zionism actually means. That it's not just about being pro-Israel, that there's something much deeper going on. And this reminded me a lot of Einat Wilf's essay from Jewish Priorities called Zionism as Therapy, in which she explores how teaching a course on early Zionist thought triggered something in many of the students' minds, because the problematic nature of the Jewish spirit after centuries of what they then called exile saw in Zionism a kind of therapeutic response to building your own character, your own soul, and that Zionism initially wasn't just about a political movement to build a state. It was about almost a reinvention of the Jewish character. So there's a lot of that going on in this book. And finally, there seems to be a bit of like a rebellion against kind of the kind of boilerplate sense that Jewish identity is the education for Jewish identity focuses on basically two things: the Holocaust and the state of Israel and Zionism in its political sense. This is a lot of the people in this book are rebelling against that. They're saying, no, you can't build Jewish identity on our having been slaughtered or our having been redeemed. It basically boils all of being Jewish down to a 10-year period in the middle of the 20th century when we have 3,000 years of history behind us. And so you have essays that are exploring their relationship with the land of Israel. You have essays that are connecting their learning of Judaism to building their own confidence and their own knowledge base from which to then take on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Those three, I think, were the biggest kind of surprises and most interesting to me. I'm sure there are others that other people will find.
Great. So I'll be, conscious of time. I always enjoy our conversations, but people are here actually to hear the panelists. So I'm going to let you take it from here and bring up the panelists as you introduce them. I'm going to recede into the background for the rest of those who are going to miss me, and I will take questions as the event unfolds, and we will ask at the end, have a conversation with our panelists. So David, thank you. And to the rest of you, thank you for joining us to this global digital launch of Young Zionist Voices, and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Amitai. So I'm going to ask Grace if you can to just toss the link up into the chat, just if anybody wishes to get their own copy of Young Zionist Voices during the call. Thank you. I'm going to call up each panelist, and when I do, just ask the panelists to turn on their cameras when I call your name. And I'll also just introduce them. So Shabbos Kestenbaum is a student activist and the lead plaintiff against Harvard University, alleging pervasive and systemic anti-Semitism. He is a regular contributor on national media, has testified in front of the US Congress multiple times, and lectures internationally on Jewish communal issues. Adela Cojab is a lawyer, activist, and media contributor. In 2019, she filed the first ever Title VI complaint against NYU for failing to protect Jewish students from harassment during her time as an undergraduate. Her work from political advocacy to interfaith peace rallies has been recognized internationally, earning her designations as one of Hadassah's 18 Zionist American Women of 2024, Jewish Week's 36 Under 36, and JNS's Top 40 Latin American Pro-Israel Advocates. She co-hosts the interfaith podcast Americanish, Daughters of Diaspora, and as of 2024, hosts the Open Door Media show Today Unpacked on YouTube. She holds a JD from the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law and a BA from NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study with a concentration in Middle East diaspora structures. Alissa Bernstein is the assistant director of the American Jewish Committee in Los Angeles, where she manages the region's political outreach, legislative advocacy, and interfaith and intergroup coalition building. Originally from Palo Alto, California, where Z3 is based, she graduated cum laude from Occidental College with a degree in psychology and Spanish, where she spent her time advocating for Jewish issues and creating educational opportunities with the administration about campus anti-Semitism. Shanie Reichman is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Director of IPF Atid at Israel Policy Forum based in New York City, where she works to elevate the discourse around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and is a frequent host of the Israel Policy Pod. Shanie serves as the founding co-chair of the Forum Dvorah U.S. Committee, as a Wexner Field Fellow, a Schusterman ROIer, on the board of Queens College Hillel, on the Advisory Council for the Center for Ethnic, Racial, and Religious Understanding, and as a mentor with Girl Security. Her work has been published in The Forward, The Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, Hey Alma, Jewish Unpacked, E-Jewish Philanthropy, and International Policy Digest. Oz Bin Nun is studying psychology and philosophy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has served as an emissary of the Jewish Agency at the University of Wisconsin and is a graduate of the Bronfman Fellowships. A writer, content creator, and social activist, he served as commander in the Egoz Commando Unit in the 2023-24 Gaza War. I will also point out that my son Amichai is also from the Egoz Commando Unit. I know what they went through very, very well, both in their training and on October 7th and in the months after. So he's a real fighter and a real, and I mean, this is, if you haven't heard of Egoz, it's because they don't make it into the news as much. They don't go do a lot of major fundraising in North America, but they are one of the top elite units in the IDF. So thank you very much, Oz, for being with us as well, and thank you all. I want to start with a quote from your essay, Shabbos. He writes, ultimately, while October 7th unleashed unparalleled anti-Semitism in the United States, it has awakened a new spirit within young Jewish Americans. This next generation is full of impassioned Zionists who recognize Israel's promise and the necessity of keeping it strong. I can confidently assure those who are worried about college encampments and hostility towards Israel, those who are worried that the golden age is ending, and those worried that support for Zionism and our ideals is eroding, to merely look at the Jewish students speaking out. The future is in good hands. Shabbos, you know, all of you guys wrote your essays months ago, right? Books take time to produce and they take time to come out. And first thing I want to ask you, Shabbos, is do you still stand by this? Do you think that the young generation is full of impassioned Zionists who recognize Israel's promise and the necessity of keeping it strong?
I am shocked I was able to articulate it that well because I'm not a very good writer. So yes, I stand by it, and I will use my day today as evidence. I'm actually in Israel. I'm actually meant to be having a meeting with quote unquote Israeli influencers, but I said no. I had the Z3 Zoom tonight. We're part of a delegation with the Israel foreign minister. We had a meeting with Gideon Saar this morning, the foreign minister. We were at the Kerem Shalom border crossing today, then at Nir Oz. We're meeting freed hostages tomorrow. And the delegation is American Jews who are, since October 7th, vocal on social media, content creators. These are people, myself included, who are not particularly passionate or public or open about their affection and affinity of the land of Israel and their Jewish values. And since October 7th, they have really taken charge of the future of the Jewish people. So just by virtue of the 30 people who are at the front lines, these are people who had woken up post-October 7th. And I'll say one other thing. I'm in a group chat that I helped organize of roughly 100 students from across the country. These are students who've testified in front of Congress, who appear on national media, who are suing their university. That's one of the three things we have in common. And these are individuals who, as I said, just like this delegation trip, were not particularly active, myself included, as it pertains to Israel and Judaism and campus life, and something within us awoke. And it is incredibly inspiring to be part of that movement. And yes, I travel across the country. I guess I travel across the world now. And I can tell you the amount of people who have come up to me after I finished a speech, or have come up to me after a rally, or whatever it happens to be, and said, you know, I bought a kippah after October 7th. I wear my Star of David necklace. I have put the Israeli flag on my bio. Whatever fighting back or resistance looks to them, then 100% we are in a much, much stronger and better place. And I know the media likes to talk about the anti-Zionist left within the Jewish community, but rest assured they are a deeply intellectually challenged minority. They do not represent even a tenth of American Jewry, but they just make a lot of noise. So let's not focus on them.
So you mentioned this, and I recall that back in the spring of last year, there were two studies that came out. One by the Jewish Federations of North America, and the other by the American Jewish Committee, which pointed to what they called a surge in Jewish and Israel engagement that had happened in the wake of October 7th. And of course, since we're Jews, we look for we look for the cloud rather than the silver lining. And a lot of people said, okay, but let's see if it keeps up, if this is just a sudden thing that'll just go back down again, or whether this is a permanent change. Adela, you like Shabbos have really been focused on campuses to a large degree. Like Shabbos, you also sued your own university. You were the pioneer in the lawsuits under Title VI. Do you see a fundamental permanent shift among students? And I'm talking about Jewish students or pro-Israel students, but particularly I'm interested in Jewish students. Do you see that that there's been a lot of people waking up and participating and figuring out ways to fight back?
Yeah, from what I've seen, students are definitely awake, and they're a lot braver than when I was on campus. When I was in school, which was 2015 to 2019, as an undergraduate, we had, a small board, and we had our events, and our events had maybe, 30 to 50 people on a good day, and our massive events had maybe 200 to 300 people, right? Which was a lot of fun. But end of the day, we were a board of, maybe 10 students that got together and planned these events every week. When I decided to sue NYU, at that point, we had grown tremendously. Why? Because unfortunately, whether or not we want to accept it, we come together during crisis. And sometimes you need that little wake up to realize that you have to do much more. When I speak to students today, it's not one student against one school after one flag burning, which was me. It's a group of 4, 5, 6 plaintiffs, right? Columbia has a class action with over 140 plaintiffs. Suddenly, every single Jewish student is feeling that they have the responsibility to stand up, even if they're not taking legal action. I've spoken to so many students that decided not to file a case, but end of the day, every single student is saying, well, I'm having this issue, how can I stand up? I think that's a really good shift. I think, again, they're much braver. I hear the way they testify before Congress when I see Shabbos and the new wave of students like Ed, and it really is something that I say, wow, 20-year-old me would have been so scared to do what they're doing, right? And that was me, the one who sued. At the same time, I also think that the Jewish institutional world has woken up. And I can't even tell you the amount of schools I've spoken to, not just colleges anymore and high schools, but I'm speaking to middle schools and elementary schools about the importance of Jewish identity and standing up for who you are. So I think institutionally, we've made that shift where we're training these students from elementary, middle, high school into college. So when they show up, the college students don't have to wake up. They're already trained. So I have a sense of peace for what's to come. I'm very excited for the students. And I say, if these are the students that we're leaving the Jewish future hands in, then I think we're going to have a really bright Jewish future.
Wow. Shanie, I'd like to maybe just shift a little bit from campuses to the sort of slightly older cohort, the world of young professionals, because this is an area where it's not in our faces. We don't hear about what goes on, what they experience once they're in the workforce, once they're in Jewish communal professions. But these are, for in many ways the same group. You graduate college, you go into the workforce, and you wrote an essay that called "Include Our Critics or We'll Lose Our Soul," which was published today on the Jewish Priorities Substack. I will mention that all of the essays, all of the writers today, their essays appear on the Jewish Priorities Substack. You essentially issued a kind of a warning. Yes, we need to all come together and be Zionists, whatever that precisely might mean. But you already are beginning to see signs, perhaps, that if we really want to be effective, both for undergraduates and for young people in the workforce, we need to find ways to be inclusive within that inclusive within that tent. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? What are you worried about?
Sure. I'll just start by saying I completely agree with Adela's assessment that there are so many communities that try to stay far, far away from Israel. And I've been doing this work for 8 years. I was begging them, please do any kind of program on the conflict. We'll bring in Palestinians. We'll be very balanced. And they really tried to shy away. And I've been nonstop getting calls from them the past year, speaking in communities that frankly have a lot of anti-Zionists in them and were always really afraid to delve in, that have been realizing it's too late to be silent and it's impossible to be silent. So it's time to actually engage with this. So I've been really thrilled to see that. That said, I am concerned by a few things. Boundless Israel, which many of you are familiar with, had an amazing survey that also had some pretty unfortunate data from it back in August, right? It was entirely around 18 to 40-year-olds in the American Jewish community. Now, Shabbos is right. The vast, vast majority of them, 85%, support the state of Israel and support the right of Israel to exist. Only 5% are anti-Zionist, but only 31% call themselves a Zionist, right? That's a massive problem. Once you define it for them, it jumps to about 50%. Still not breaking any records here. As far as I'm concerned, that full 85% should call themselves Zionists, right? And to me, that speaks to something in our definition, something about how our community is functioning. And that's why I push for a much more inclusive and nuanced perspective and how we're going to talk about Zionism to make sure we're not alienating the 70% of people who in American Jewish community who apparently don't identify with Zionism. And I can speak more later about sort of how I lay out those pieces, but I do think a lot of it's on the left because as this poll lists, 55% of American Jews who are 18 to 40 identify as progressive or liberal. Only 19% call themselves conservative, right? And so it's safe to assume that this enormous demographic that I'm trying to capture, now I work across the political spectrum, but I'm deeply invested in capturing the left because I think that's where we're most at risk of losing people from the Zionist camp. And so I try to think about ways to keep engaging them. But these numbers do kind of concern me despite the surge, which I mean, every one of us who works at definitely Alissa knows at HAC, all of our Jewish institutions have seen an amazing influx of people, but we need to make sure we're capturing them and that they're continuing to engage with Israel in a thoughtful way.
So I do want to ask you, Alissa, if you could respond to that. You work in the AJC, you encounter Jewish communities of a broad spectrum of political and religious outlooks. What do you think is necessary to shift that 31% more towards the 85%? Because I also noticed that gap, and I think it's wild. It suggests that the anti-Zionist rhetoric for years has had a very big impact on the Jewish community.
I could speak to this topic for years, but I'll keep it to a couple of minutes for everyone's sake. You're absolutely right, Shanie, that we've seen a huge influx, especially in young people, getting more engaged when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism, protecting the Jewish community, standing up for Israel, and becoming more empowered in their Zionist identities. It's been, particularly after October 7th, and I'm seeing more and more young people, I mean, below the age of 25, just out of college, saying, okay, put us to work. We're ready, send us to Sacramento, send us to DC, like put us in the room where it happens. We want to speak to the people that matter and let them know what our priorities are. Every single year we're seeing more people, and it's been incredible. And I think that one of the most impactful tools, and I spoke about this in November at the Z3 conference, has been that I'm finding that young Jews are becoming more reconnected with their Jewish identity, not just as this sort of broad, vague culture of eating matzah and, gefilte fish or whatever, whatever your go-to Jewish food may be. I'm not personally a fan of gefilte fish, but for the sake of the argument, they're not just saying, I'm a cultural Jew. More and more I'm seeing that people understand Jewish indigeneity. They're understanding our deep-rooted genetic tie to Israel and the land of Israel. There's a reason why all of a sudden after October 7th, people, this springing into action to support Israel didn't come out of nowhere. This connection to Israel lies, whether we choose to make it active or not, lies within us. And for many, it was just a connection that lay dormant because they didn't have the permission, they didn't have the opportunity to speak up. And as they're learning more and more, whether that be through AJC programs like Leaders for Tomorrow, which is a leadership training program for high school students, or, young professionals networks like IPF Atid or Access at AJC, it allows the opportunity to understand where they come from. If you don't know where you come from, you're not going to know where you're going. And if you don't know who you are, you'll never be able to advocate for yourself or your community. These are things that I 1,000,000% believe to be true. And I'm seeing more and more young people get more involved in USY and BBYO and NIFTY and DILR and, all of these incredible programs, starting from a young age, programs I wish I had. I mean, I had USY, but these advocacy programs that help train young professionals and educate them and young students on their history, not just, as you mentioned, Holocaust and on, because to say that Jewish history the Holocaust starts with that tragedy is not only inaccurate, it's a huge disservice to the Jewish people. And more young folks are waking up to that fact and starting to really educate themselves and sit down and learn about where they come from. And I think that is the most effective and most important tool to being a strong advocate and to reawakening that. And I say reawakening because we have this inherent connection to Israel, whether or not you want to accept it, whether or not you want to talk about it. It allows us to reawaken that connection to Israel and really wear it on our sleeve.
So I want to take the conversation to a deeper place, if that's okay. Oz, you're a warrior. You were an emissary on American Jewish campuses. You're familiar with American Jewish life as well as the Israeli experience. But your essay doesn't talk about that. Your essay, or maybe it does. Your essay goes to talk about Mordechai Kaplan, who was one of the most important American Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. He has the JCC movement and the Reconstructionist movement under his belt as inspirations. And you brought what was, I think, an obscure essay of his, short book of his called A New Zionism, which he wrote in the 1950s, kind of as a response to this, what you call Ben-Gurionite view of Zionism, which is it's about statehood, it's about politics, which is something that the word Zionism has come to mean for American Jews supporting Israel. But Kaplan takes it in a very different direction. I'm wondering whether this can offer one answer to the question of how do we bridge that 31% to 85% gap. Why was it important for you to write about Kaplan and what was he saying? And why is it crucial? The name of your essay was Why Mordechai Kaplan Matters After October 7th. So maybe share with us a little bit about that. And then I'm going to do a quick rapid fire round on another question before we turn it over to the audience.
Sure. So I know it's kind of like, it seems like an intellectual thing, which it is. But for me, I came back from 2 years as an Israeli emissary in Madison, Wisconsin, on campus with students there. And 2 months after we got back to Israel, October 7th happened. I went and I fought in Kibbutz Magen during October 7th. And since then, I served for 4 months and more after, but in the north with my team. And because I need to read stuff. So during the war, I read a lot. I mean, very kind of like try to look around, see on Twitter, on Facebook, what people are writing or thinking. And I got a really strong sense of things doesn't fit, like the way Israelis are talking about Zionism and the way Zionism as a thing is affecting the world or behaving even in the world doesn't fit. And for me, the need for rethinking about Zionism is not just an intellectual thing or kind of like I want to play with the definition to fit for American Jewish people, kind of like to identify as Zionist, but as an existential state of mind. Because right now, the way that I see it, we're facing a huge challenge in so many front lines. And it's true about Israel, it's very kind of like clear in Israel, right? I need, in March, I have miluim, I need to be in reserve for a whole month. It's very clear that I need to take a gun and the gear and to do what I need to do. But I think that it's also kind of an illusion. And it's kind of a comfort zone for Israelis. And because I'm the Israeli here, I can be critical against Israelis. It's kind of a comfort zone for Israelis to feel that, okay, we are the protagonist of the story. We are the main character. And everyone else is the sidekick. And I think that it's not just that it's not true, but also it's very ineffective and even destructive. Because I think that right now, the Jewish people as a whole are facing a lot of challenges. And the only way to face that, as the panelists before me said so beautifully, is to feel that is on me, is the internal sense of control that I think Mordechai Kaplan explained so in an amazing way of I don't trust anyone else to protect the Jewish people. I don't even trust God to protect the Jewish people. I need to protect. I need to save Jewish people. And I need to make sure that they are safe, that they can flourish, that they're in a good situation. And this is why I think the rethink or redefine Zionism, the way that I try to do in the article, is so crucial. And for me, it's part of being outside of the character of, okay, we are the Israelis, we are fighting, we are the only story. It's not true. It's a huge part of the Jewish story, but it's still part of the story.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, well, Amitai Freeman, who everyone saw earlier and will see again, speaks often about the concept of islands of sovereignty, that we need to rethink diaspora life in a sort of a sovereign mindset vis-a-vis our own communities, that these are our responsibility, and that when Jews are in trouble in one community, that other communities come to support them. I want to do a real fast round. I have two burning questions I want to ask each of you, and I would like you each to answer as short as you possibly can, because we still want to give people a chance. And in the meantime, I would love to ask the audience to put your questions in the chat. As we're in a few minutes, we will hand it over back to Amitai, who will lead the Q&A portion. Question number one, and I want you each to address both questions quickly. Number one, I want to know what has been the hardest thing that you've had to deal with since October 7th. Question number two, and I think that we all are very much aware that there is a new president in the White House and a new administration. And without going into politics and your general feelings about the election or about the president, I would like to know how you feel the anti-Semitism issue is likely to be affected, whether this is how it will benefit and how it may not benefit the communities that you see and are interacting with on a regular basis. I want your answers to be shorter than the question was, if possible, because the question was too long. So number one, what was the hardest thing? And number two, how do you see things moving forward in this new reality? And I'll go in reverse order from we went before, starting with Oz.
I think I'll answer just the first one. I think October 7th will be the easiest part. But I think that I came back after my 4 months of serving to talk in my university in Madison, Wisconsin on February 2024, and to see my students, and specifically students who define themselves as liberals and had a lot of friends from kind of like studying gender study or stuff like that. The way that they looked and the way that they shared, the story that they shared with me about the way their friends talked to them, it crushed me. It was so hard.
Wow. Okay, Alissa, hardest part and what's happening going forward?
I'd say the hardest part, as much as I encourage and urge all Jews to wear their advocacy on their sleeve and wear their Zionism on their sleeve, making sure that I don't make my entire Jewish identity centered around tragedy and hardship and pain. As advocates, we're all inclined to constantly be in this world, constantly use our voices. And I've had to remind myself to step back, I stop looking at the news on the weekend where I can practice, Shabbat and experience Jewish joy outside of the pain. I think that's separating yourself from that. And especially being a professional Jew, I like to call myself that, making sure that I'm a Jewish person outside of that and enjoying all of the joy that comes with it. Going forward, I think there are challenges across the political spectrum when it comes to the Jewish community in Israel, no matter how you see it. I work for a nonpartisan Jewish advocacy organization. We work with people across the political spectrum with vastly different views on Israel and other issues. And whereas on the left, we've seen and continue to see a huge level of anti-Zionism and how that, the anti-Semitism that comes out of that camp. But, we also see on the right in this country, far right extremism and anti-Semitism. This isn't new. It's more obvious and a little bit easier, and they're very self-proclaimed Jew haters, so it makes our work a little bit easier because people tend to agree they're not all that great. But I think going forward in my role, especially trying to urge as much bipartisan cooperation when it comes to the topic of Israel is incredibly important. Bridging that gap across the political aisle, I think is going to be one of the hardest things that we have to do, but one of the most important, not only for Israel's sake and the Jewish community, but for our country.
Shanie, hardest part and moving forward.
Sure. The week of October, obviously October 7th itself, waking up to that news was horrible. The following 2 weeks, IPF Atid hosted community check-ins, so sort of like support groups around the country in every chapter city, which is a little bit outside of our wheelhouse, or it was outside our wheelhouse because we're policy briefings usually. And seeing the influx of people who are typically in more progressive and liberal circles showing up and saying, I haven't thought about Israel for 10 years and I didn't think I had to, but I felt completely abandoned this morning, right? My friends are celebrating what happened on social media. So that was really painful, similar to what Oz said, really painful to see. And I'm glad we're able to be there for a lot of those folks. In terms of, on the government side, I'm always an optimist. So I'm trying to be optimistic, just like I would have been optimistic if there was a Harris administration for different reasons. But I think some of the isolationism on the right worries me from the foreign policy perspective. But generally, I think there's a lot of obvious things to call out, like Alissa named, but I'm still generally hopeful that there are some good allies in the White House as well.
Great. Adela.
So I think there's two quick difficulties that I've been having since October 7th. One is speaking to parents. As much as I think that students are strong, I think their parents are much weaker. And it's very difficult after I give a talk or a speech to sit down with parents who are genuinely concerned for their children's safety, rightfully so. And for me to tell them, believe me, your kids have this, it's going to be okay. Or parents say something like, my kids will never go to Stanford. My child got into Yale. I'm not sending him in a billion years. And that divide between the old generation of Jews and the new generation of Jews has been very difficult to navigate. And similarly, being a non-Israeli Jew living in the United States, difficulty with competing messages. I think that having a platform, as we all know, Jews have two Jews, three opinions. You get approached by multiple groups, some that say it's time to bring them home by any cost, and then groups that say a ceasefire releasing prisoners is jeopardizing our safety. And when you're approached and asked to amplify two different messages, both of which you believe in, it becomes very difficult. And I know that a lot of people have been struggling with that too. In terms of where I see everything in terms of the new administration, I have to say I'm extremely optimistic in terms of the anti-Semitism because of the new administration. I think that when I sued NYU, it was 2019, and I was one student against one school after one flag burning, and that led to a call from the White House and an executive order expanding the definition of Judaism to protect Jewish students on campus. And then after October 7th, when we saw every campus explode in anti-Semitism, we heard nothing. We heard nothing. And we always say if they wanted to, they would. And clearly I saw they didn't want to. what I've seen from this administration over the last 2 weeks is an administration that if they wanted to, they would, and they're doing it. So I think in terms of institutional anti-Semitism, we're going to see a crackdown, and it's going to have to be a top-down change, because bottom up, it simply would not happen.
Shabbos.
Sure. So the hardest part since 7 has obviously been the anti-Semitism, but outside of that, it's working with Jewish nonprofits. I mean, it is impossible to say anything publicly that is constructive criticism without being relentlessly attacked for trying to sow division. You know, it is remarkable. I was at the Knesset 3 weeks ago. I was giving a talk, and Jonathan Greenblatt, who's a very good guy, he's a nice man, you know, was upstairs, and he was saying publicly that we at the ADL have been unable to turn the tide against the inferno of anti-Semitism. And he said that, and it didn't really elicit any outrage in the US. Meanwhile, the legacy Jewish nonprofits, ADL, AJC, Hale International, they've raised hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And meanwhile, our college campuses are a disaster. We couldn't pass the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. We couldn't pass the Deterrent Act. We couldn't pass the No Foreign Gifts Act, which again really solidifies why I'm so optimistic about young American Jews, because they're not really willing to wait for Jewish nonprofits to get their act together. We're just going to do it ourselves. In terms of the second part of the question, exactly what Adela just said. I'm incredibly optimistic. This is someone who's going to deport foreign students who violate American law, which is not bigoted or Islamophobic or controversial. That has literally been American law for 50 years. It's just never enforced. He's someone who's going to crack down on DEI. He is someone who is going to tax university endowments. He's someone who's going to withhold federal funds. And again, Adela just said this. It's a pretty damn shame that the Biden administration could have literally done any of these things literally anytime he wanted and refused. It's a shame that Kamala Harris refused to meet with a single Jewish student since October 7th. So I'm a Democrat. I've only voted for Democrats, but of course I made a relatively public break with this last election. And I will say this very publicly, and I have said this to Democratic political operatives. I will continue to vote for the Republican nominee so long as my party, the Democratic Party, don't take issues of anti-Semitism seriously. In the same way that the African-American community should vote for their best interests and there are concessions made to the NAACP, in the same way that the LGBTQ plus community should vote for their national interests and there are concessions made to the Human Rights Campaign, there should be concessions made to the Jewish community. And if the Democratic Party does not want to make those concessions, fine, that's their prerogative. But then don't come begging for us for votes.
Okay, great. So I appreciate all of you coming. This has been fantastic. I want to turn it over back to keep your cameras on because I would like you to be available to answer questions. I'll turn it back over to Amitai, who is going to turn his camera on. And I'll ask Grace if you could once again put the link in for purchasing your own copy of Young Zionist Voices. And Amitai is going to field the questions.
So yeah, thank you for this. This is just a peek into what this book with these essays includes. I reread the essays of the panelists, of course, before this call, and it was very educational, exciting the second time around. And I really encourage you to purchase the book to get an even broader sense of what's going on and what this generation has to say about the state of Zionism and Jewish people in our future. So thank you for that very rich conversation. We got a few questions, and none of the questions really were addressed to anybody in particular. So we'll ask them kind of generally. I have my own questions if we need, but we'll start with some questions from the audience. So early on, when we talked about the shift of or the change in what we're seeing in this generation, we got a question that wants to kind of add another layer, right? So there seems to be a group of young adults, this is a question, who are realizing that, what it means to be Jewish because they are singled out by others. And the question is, what is the opportunity that lies in this moment?
I can hop. Oh, go ahead. So I always talk about salient identities, right? And your salient identity, which is the identity that comes out the most, is usually the one that's under attack. When it's under attack, you can either mute it so you could fit in, or you own it because it's what makes you different. So, for example, when I went to a Syrian Jewish day school where everyone was a Syrian Jew like me, my salient identities were being female and being Mexican. I was born in Mexico. So I leaned into being a Mexican Jew and leaned into being a female Jew with the female Jewish experience, experiencing Syrian Judaism as a woman. Then suddenly I show up to campus, no one really cares that I was born in Mexico. No one really cares that I'm a woman. I feel very comfortable. And suddenly my Judaism and Zionism are things that were under attack. And again, you have the moment of fight or flight. And I chose to fight. So what opportunity exists here? I think that we had that moment where everyone woke up. And I think speaking to a lot of Jewish influencers, some realized that their engagement was low, things like that. And it's because, like I said, people come together over crisis. And the question is, how do we keep them from falling apart? And I think that it's the consistent engagement of building community. Why would someone keep coming back after a BDS vote? If you have a BDS vote, all the Jewish students come because they want to stand up against BDS. 3 weeks after BDS, how do you get those students back? When they want to see the students they met in that first meeting. So I think that right now is the moment for not necessarily the activists. The activists had our moment. We're still going to keep fighting, but now it's time for the community builders. It's time to create that moment where students want to keep coming back to it to say, I awoke my Jewish identity. Now let me anchor myself in it. And the only way to do it is through others.
Thank
I'll
you.
just-
Yeah, Oz, you want to take a... Oh, Shanie was also going
Yeah,
to.
Shanie
Multiple
can.
people in here. All right, Shanie, and then Oz.
I was just going to say that the survey data that I was speaking about earlier did ask explicitly what young American Jews 18 to 40 want to see more of. And so we do have a pretty good sense that they are really looking for greater confidence speaking about Israel and particularly about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they're looking to be more knowledgeable beyond sort of slogans and traditional talking points, which is precisely my job, luckily. And the other piece of it, which I think is really important, is that 80% of them wanted to be connected with Israelis and understand their experience better. 78% said the same thing about Palestinians. So I think we have a clear opportunity there to be connecting them to people on the ground, which is a really, really high priority for me, particularly those who share their values and also those who don't, right? Israelis and Palestinians, very different opinions than American Jews in their 20s. And that's okay. I think we shouldn't shy away from either of those groups for that reason.
Oz.
Yeah, so I think we have a kind of a parallel situation in Israel, even though there are some differences. So I think the younger or the young generation in Israel right now, the main difference between the older generation and the younger is the ability to prioritize things. I think it's also true for the US or North America, but right now in Israel, a lot of young people, and I'm involved in several different projects, are kind of like looking up to the older generation and saying like, you need to rethink about your priorities. And the young generation, because we experience firsthand the huge tragedy of October 7th, and we had to pay the price, unfortunately. And to some extent, I think that a lot of young people in Israel are feeling that we are actually also kind of the adults, because the adults are still fighting between themselves, even now. And to some extent, I think that the Bsorah, right? Like the new message to the world of the gospel, of the young generation. It's true also in the US, but for sure here in Israel, I feel that every day is that, like, fellas, we have to stop all the, sorry for my French, bullshit, and we need to focus on how we are keeping our people safe. And I think it's true for the US and it's true for Israel, for sure.
Thank you. So we got a question here that I want to start Dafka with Oz and with Adela, but of course it's open to everybody. In particular, based on your, what you've written and what you've spoken about. So there's a question about the role of Aliyah in traditional, in this, in Zionist education. So, Adela, you talk about we're here to stay. And that's something, don't leave the universities, don't leave the diasporas that we're here to stay. And Oz, you talk about an expansion of the idea of Zionism a la Mordechai Kaplan. And I'm curious to hear your, everybody's perspective, but I'll start with you two because it really cuts to the core of what you've been talking about.
So I think that Aliyah is an extremely complicated issue. As a former Israeli emissary on campus, it's things that like all the Israelis are telling you, like, you need to convince people to make Aliyah. And I never agreed with that. Like, I think that being Jewish, being Jew, and being Zionist is something that needs to be deeply rooted in your identity, in your story. And the idea of like anyone everywhere should make Aliyah, for me, makes zero sense. this is why the whole idea of my essay is, it doesn't really matter where are you right now physically. Is that what matters is that you need to take responsibility right now for the people around you. And I think this is something that a lot of people who are talking about Aliyah, they're missing something. They still trying to hold the idea of my story is the only story and you should join my story. But I think it's way more important that everyone from the Jewish community around the world will decide that doesn't really what story they are holding, it matters how they are acting in their narrative, in their story. And I think this is what makes a huge difference. We can see it right now in front of us. People from different places are doing different stuff, but everything is so impactful and meaningful because they are taking responsibility. And this is why I think Aliyah, it's not, I don't say it's not important, but I don't think it's like in the priorities, I don't think it's the main or the first priority here.
So I love the Aliyah question because it's controversial, and I hope that this stirs up, something in the comments and conversations in your own homes. I always say that campuses are the microcosm for the world. So when we saw things get dangerous on campus, everyone said, let me pull my Jewish child out of this school and let me send them to a Jewish school like Yeshiva University. And that's great, except it creates a problem that I call self-ghettoization. And when you self-ghettoize, you take Jewish students out of the institutions that they, number one, deserve and want to be part of. And number two, you're taking out any Jew that other people might interact with. When you let other people decide where a Jew can and cannot feel comfortable, you are allowing anti-Semitism to win. Now, if you look at that on a larger scale, when things got dangerous in the diaspora, we had so many Jews spring up and say, it's time to move to Israel. That is a fear response. If you want to go to Yeshiva University, that's wonderful. If you want to make Aliyah, that's wonderful, as long as it's coming from inside of your Jewish soul and it's not a decision that's based on fear. Because when you take the Jew out based on fear, number one, the community that you're going to be building isn't going to be a strong, empowered community. It's going to be a community that's going to feel shunned within themselves and never interact with the outside world. And number two, you're leaving the outside world without a Jewish voice. Whether or not you send your child to a school like Harvard, guess what? There's a wait list and their seat will be filled by someone else, number one. And number two, whether or not your child becomes the leader of tomorrow, which he should, rightfully so. If you look at the Supreme Court bench, we have what? Harvard, Yale. If your child doesn't go to Harvard and Yale, whoever did will become the leader of tomorrow. And I would rather that leader have a Jewish friend. As much as I don't think Jews in the diaspora can exist without Israel, Israel cannot exist without Jews in the diaspora. I really do think that we're a community that goes hand in hand. One cannot exist without the other. And we as diaspora Jews, it's our responsibility to the Jews in Israel to stand strong here and make sure we're holding down the fort.
Thank you. Alissa or Shanie or Shabbos, you want to take any of that question, or I can move to the next one?
Adela really took every single word right out of my mouth. I think you said it so perfectly. It's an amazing opportunity for those who feel intrinsically that they want to return to the homeland and express their Judaism and their Zionism in that way. But we have to work hand in hand. Israel needs a voice in the diaspora. We need to be able to work together to speak to one another's priorities, and we have to be able to stand up in the face of hate and not allow ourselves to create a vacuum for hate. As Adela said, there are so many people who go to college and have never met a Jew. And if you remove yourself from that campus, you may be the Jewish person that they will never meet. And as such, never have a positive association with the Jewish community. And that is a huge loss. So, stand in the discomfort and try to make it a little bit more comfortable for everybody around you.
So as it pertains to Aliyah and an affinity towards the state of Israel, I agree, broadly speaking, that we should run to something, not run from something. So you should move to Israel because it is our ancestral homeland, because you can be an authentically practicing Jew in any way that looks like to you, because that is the place of our forefathers. That's why you should go to Israel, not because, some idiots are drawing swastikas on the subways. So in general, run to something, not run from something. Having said that, and I say this with enormous respect and gratitude to Adela, because Adela, I was going to say you're the grandmother of this, but you're like 2 years older than me, so I don't want to age you. But Adela paved the way for all of us to file our lawsuits. But I would say this. The premise or the assumption of the argument that we need to be in these spaces now more than ever is that these places are worthy. These places are institutions of power and of meaning. And I just don't think that's true anymore. And I think the American people see that as well. I think it's a very good thing that Harvard has had a 15% drop in early applications. They've had a 5% drop in applications overall. They've had hundreds of millions of dollars in donations being rescinded. They're going to have their federal funds withheld. They are on the cold open of Saturday Night Live. I have a list in my phone of billionaires, of hedge fund managers, of CEOs who've told me to my face, you know, Shabbos, unless they explicitly state that they support American values, we are not going to hire Harvard graduates or Columbia graduates or Yale graduates anymore. So while it's true, Supreme Court justices have come from Harvard and Yale in the past. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett did not go to Harvard or Yale. I think she went to Duke, but someone can fact check me on that. So the future of higher education is one where education is the primary concern, which is why I look at what Barry Weiss is doing in Texas, the University of Austin. I look at Georgia Tech. I look at University of Florida, the University of Miami, Vanderbilt, University of Chicago. There are really good institutions of higher learning out there, and they are not called Yale, Columbia, Harvard. In fact, Forbes magazine had an article a couple of months ago called The New Ivy Leagues, and it really demonstrated that the American people are moving away from this sense of moral hypocrisy and intellectual bankruptcy. And love Trump or hate Trump, the reaction of Harvard University the day after Trump was reelected was a significant amount of professors canceled classes. DEI hired Sunshine the Puppet to console students. There was story time with Marty. There was basket weaving. There was free massages. So this is just not an institution worthy, forget about Jews, for the American people. It's just a silly institution that has been hijacked by wokeism and political indoctrination. You know, as I said, I speak a lot, and I've never once had a parent ever come up to me and say, we need to send our kids to Rockland Community College, because Rockland Community College had an encampment, and they have tons of anti-Semitic professors. Quantitatively, it's probably more than Harvard and Columbia, but no one's made that argument to me ever. Because why? No offense to any RCC alumni who may be watching, but no one cares about Rockland Community College. No one cares. And I simply want to create that narrative around Harvard and Columbia and Yale. People should not care about those institutions. They should not care about the impressive sounding degrees. And again, the business world, the corporate world, and the American people, they're slowly beginning to turn the tide. And love Donald Trump, hate Donald Trump, the election was a clear repudiation of Ivy League values. It was a clear repudiation from the American people, not just the Jewish community, but the American people, saying that they are tired of institutions of higher learning that clearly are teaching their students to hate capitalism, to hate the West, and to hate the United States. And I'm very, very grateful that so many Americans are waking up to that reality.
Okay, so thank you for that, all of you. One last question. You kind of touched upon it a little bit. It'll be a two-part, and this is really the last one for those of you who want to chime in. There's a lot of conversation about fear-driven decisions. Shanie, if it's talking about the fear of losing people. Alissa, you write about, doubling down, being proud of who we are, and this kind of a response to fear. Generally speaking, this fight or flight is something that's very, very, very strong in this discourse. So I want to, maybe if we can end this call or this part of this panel with a little bit more of a hopeful message. What are things that comfort you all when you feel that fear? Where do you turn to for those sources of inspiration? And maybe share with our audiences some tips on how to deal with that, because there are some scary things out there as well.
Sure, I'm happy to start. Obviously, drawing a lot of hope, like all of us who work in the Jewish communal space, from the people who show up at the organizations who never stepped a foot in the door and never touched Israel or Jewish life until October 7th. Very inspired to see a lot of those people. But more than that, I think that people are thinking very critically in a way that they didn't before. I think that even those in the pro-Israel community, or in some ways maybe especially them, were very comfortable to not think that hard about the conflict, not think that hard about a lot of the on the ground issues, including and especially those that were, different from them. All the issues that challenged them day to day, it was a lot easier to ignore, and now it's become a little bit impossible to ignore. And I think that's a good thing. I think that it's good that American Jews are starting to, regardless of their opinions, have an opinion beyond, I really love to eat hummus. Like, that's great. And I'm Israeli. I care a lot about Israeli culture and connecting to Israelis on the ground. And also, you're allowed to have nuanced policy views and substantive discussions. That's important. And Israelis are waking up to that kind of at the same time, which I think is a special moment. Yes, the demographics of the young Israelis and young American Jews are vastly different. I don't need to tell you guys the numbers of young American Jews and where they identify politically versus Israelis, but that's okay. It's a very unique opportunity where we can bring them together to have really thoughtful debates, discussions, talk about the most challenging issues. I mean, that's, as some of you know, that's my job, is to not shy away from that. And I'm thrilled to see more and more people in the American Jewish community welcoming that, moving away from slogans and talking points and delving much more into the actual substance, thinking about long-term strategy, thinking about foreign policy. That's really inspiring to me.
I would love to answer with short story. So during October 7th, me and my team, we kind of like ran to the fire and to the kibbutzim near the Otef. And I don't need to, I think that we kind of like, Israelis tend to talk a lot, even in too much of graphics and stuff. And I think we all got our trauma from October 7th. But one memory that I have, and I still have all the time, is that the morning after October 7th, like October 8th, a really good friend of mine, a teammate who grew up in the kibbutz Hatzerim, he's like the kibbutznik, right? Like the classic kibbutznik that you can imagine. The first thing he did after we finished we did kind of like patrols, searching for terrorists. The first thing he did after he got off the patrol is to go and watering everything, basically. He started watering everything, went and fed the dog, because it was kind of a ghost town. And that instinct of, it doesn't matter that we got through a hell, but right now we are watering everything that we can. I think this is kind of a state of mind that make me, I can't be not optimistic after that. I think this is our only hope, and I think we have that hope. Yeah.
What an amazing note to end on. I just wanted to thank you, Amitai, and thank everyone for coming. This has been an amazing conversation. I also want to remind the panelists, please, to stay on the line. But really, wow. Amitai, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Oz and Alissa and Shabbos and Adela and Shanie. David, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to get your copy of the book. Follow us in the Z3 Project. We have more events like this in person in our country and even in Israel. So thank you for joining us again for the digital
And thank
global
you
launch.
to the team, to the
Yes, of
Z3
course.
team, to Maya and Grace and
Yes,
Do,
of course.
and
Who are,
Joelle and Elad and Sophie. Really, thank everybody. Thank you all for making this event possible.
absolutely. Toda rabba, and we'll see you in our next event.